Let's move on to our next program featuring Dr. Ali Izadi-Najafabadi, Head of Asia Pacific at Bloomberg New Energy Finance (BNEF). Dr. Ali manages BNEF activities across the Asia Pacific, focusing on the region's clean energy transition. I'm so sorry. He will share his insight on the changing global energy landscape and what it means for our transition to a low carbon future. Moderating this conversation will be our CGM Chair of Council, Dr. Gary, and Seng Kee Wong, one of our CGM Council members. Please give us a warm welcome to Dr. Ali Izadi, Dr. Gary, and SK. Over to you, Dr. Ali.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction.
Very good morning again.
Likewise. Apologies, I believe the video was disabled.
Yes, I see your opening slide there. Is Seng Kee, are you on?
I think it's all good now. Thank you.
Yes, I'm on. Yes.
Yes, I can hear you now. So once again, very warm welcome, everyone. I noticed we already have a lot of input going on in the chat, but just by way of housekeeping, do please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. A very warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ali Izadi. It's always a pleasure to have you. Let's get going because we're running a little bit behind time. I think it's a little bit of a difficult time. We have so much information we're trying to communicate. But let's start off by looking perhaps at the state of play of energy in Southeast Asia and more broadly perhaps in Asia. In your opinion, are we behind, for example, or maybe we're being influenced by China's continued reliance on coal, or maybe we're using the countries that are not quite good examples as an excuse? On the other hand, is the Asian region abreast, influenced by the rapid change in China, by organic growth of, say, solar PV in Pakistan? Or on the other hand, aided by the ecosystems that we have, including that of finance, which is why you're here, do you see Asia as being the early mover, understanding the advantages of having this early move? So over to you, Dr. Ali.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity. It's my great pleasure to present with you analysis that my colleagues around the world do on energy transition. Dr. Gary, before the webinar, the virtual conference, you kindly gave me some guidelines. So what I've tried to do is structure the presentation, starting with the first question that you asked, sort of just looking at where are we at today. I'm very lucky to go after Ian. I think his insightful presentation already set the scene very nicely. So a lot of the themes that I will discuss will reinforce the message that Ian just told us. But what I'll try to do is put a bit more of a quantitative angle on where we are today. So let's start by looking at investment in energy transition. Globally, for the first time ever last year, annual investment in energy transition technologies exceeded $2 trillion, almost $2.1 trillion. That represented about 10.7% year-on-year increase. And you can see that by technology, renewables, electrified transport, energy storage, they're doing really well. If we compare just the supply side of this investment, so looking at the amount of investment that went to providing us with clean energy supply and compare that with fossil fuel supply, we can see that since 2023, that ratio has been above 1 in favor of clean energy supply. Last year, for every dollar invested in fossil fuel supply, $1.06 US was invested in clean supply. So that's a really positive development. If you look at specifically around renewable power to, for example, coal mining and unabated thermal power, that ratio last year was 2.92, meaning that the amount of investment that went to coal mining and unabated thermal power last year, for each $1, there was almost 3 times worth of investment in renewable power. So really positive trends. If you look at financial institutions, they're also improving their performance. So for financial institutions, we can see that the ratio of investment in clean versus fossil fuel energy supply is improving, although compared to the total investment, the number is still below 1. Now, there's a lot of getting into the regional differences. If you look at financial institutions, investments, specifically commercial banks, and look at their headquarters, you can see that banks in Europe typically do better. So the ratios for them are a lot higher compared to if you look at banks across Asia Pacific. Just for reference, as I was getting ready to do the webinar, I looked up the number that we calculated for Maybank, just as a reference. And the ratio that we calculated for Maybank last year was 0.36. Now, to be fair, it's much higher than the ratio in 2021. So one immediate answer to your question is certainly in jurisdictions where regulations around emissions and climate change are much more strict, then you can see that financial institutions act accordingly and make sure that they can accelerate investment in energy transition, as we can see in the case of European headquarters banks. On the other hand, in jurisdictions where there's not similar requirements, then obviously the trends are still going positive, but not maybe as fast as they could be going. Now, getting back onto the technologies, we're really in a two-speed transition scenario where the mature technologies that are already economically competitive continue to attract investment and grow. So when we look at investments in renewables, energy storage, electrified transport, and the grid, that investment continues to grow. On the other hand, the technologies that are needed for tackling hard-to-abate sectors, so areas such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, clean fuels, also retrofitting industry, for example, building of green steel plants. These are areas where today they require either significant amounts of subsidies or very high carbon prices. And as you can see, last year, overall investment actually declined. The reason the overall investment declined is partly what was happening in the US. Even though 2024 was still the majority of the year was the previous administration, and technically the Inflation Reduction Act was still in effect, many investors looking at the upcoming election were already worried that that poses significant uncertainty in terms of continued support in the US. Now, let me focus on the power sector a little bit, given that, as Ian also pointed out, that's key for decarbonizing the overall economy. The good news for the power sector is if you look at annual capacity additions globally, since 2012, the amount of capacity additions by renewables has exceeded that of thermal power plants. Solar additions actually exceeded that of coal since 2016. The result of that is by the end of 2024, when we look at the globally installed capacity mix, solar had already become number one. Coal is still number two. So solar capacity at the end of last year had exceeded 2.2 terawatt, whereas for coal, it was around 2.1718. The renewable total also now exceeds the fossil fuel thermal power total. So that's really good news. The challenge, of course, is that the capacity factors for renewables are lower, whereas for thermal power plants are significantly higher. As a result of that, coal is still the largest source of electricity generation, but its share has gone down. So back in 2005, coal accounted for about 38.3% of world's electricity generation. Last year, that share had declined to 33.2%. In absolute terms, though, as you can see on this chart there, coal has also continued to grow. So in 2005, coal generation was about 6,700 terawatt hour. Last year, that number was about 9,800 terawatt hours. So 46.7% increase. For solar, if you look at back in 2005, it's not even visible. Over this 20-year period, solar generation has grown by 533%. So that's a remarkable growth. And the reason we have seen significant growth in renewables is, of course, the investment in scaling up and manufacturing and deployment has had a tangible impact on the cost of these technologies. So we've seen solar modules to a lesser extent wind turbines, and of course lithium-ion battery packs rapidly decline. What this means is when we calculate the levelized cost of electricity generation, so this is the benchmark typically used by power project developers and their investors to look at what sort of long-term power purchase agreement they need to meet their equity rate of return. You can see that since the middle of 2017, the weighted average for the global benchmark for renewables has been below that of building of new thermal power plants. In many parts of the world today, if you want to build a new source of electricity generation, then either solar, shown in yellow here, or wind, shown in blue, is the cheapest source of electricity generation. This is, by the way, true for Malaysia. When we calculate levelized cost of electricity generations for Malaysia, for solar, the numbers range anywhere between $33 per megawatt hour to $61 per megawatt hour. You can see for coal, the range and the weighted average is actually above that of solar. And then for gas, of course, is more expensive. There are also parts of the world that now, if you build new renewables, they're actually cheaper than the marginal cost of generation for the existing thermal power plants. So places such as India, but even in Asia, for example, in Japan, as well as in Thailand, you can see that solar is actually below the cost of marginal power generation by thermal power plants. Malaysia, by the way, is in the same boat. So when we look at calculating the levelized cost of solar, it's already for a new solar power plant, it's below running cost of a coal power plant or a gas power plant. Now, whenever we present LCOEs, one of the common criticisms is that, oh, what about firming of the power, about the system cost, those sort of things. In fact, as you can see, if you even want to have a firmed output, then yes, the LCOE will be higher, but that LCOE gets below the cost of gas generation really quickly within this decade. With marginal cost of coal generation, it's a bit more difficult absent any carbon pricing because marginal cost of coal power generation is very low. But you can see for a combined cycle gas turbine, the solar with storage can already beat it in the next couple of years. Which brings me to the next point. As Ian also mentioned, the average energy storage system cost has declined quite rapidly. So the global volume-weighted average turnkey system cost, so this is not just a battery pack, this includes the PCS, the balance of plant, had already reached $165 per kilowatt hour last year. Of course, there's a significant regional variation. The number for China was already close to $100 per kilowatt hour last year. This year actually has gone below that number. So that's a fantastic development for increasing deployment of renewables firmed up by energy storage. By the way, the new inverters, PCS, as well as increasingly the energy storage systems, they can provide additional functionality. So for example, the unfortunate blackout that happened in Spain, that is a preventable problem. So voltage control, there are a lot of inverters that have been on the market that can do that work. That case primarily was unfortunately a lack of foresight on the part of the regulator to require those technologies, but those technologies are not that expensive and they're already available. Increasingly, there are also energy storage systems with their PCS that can be grid forming and provide even synthetic inertia, meaning that the idea that we need to have thermal power plants remain in the system to maintain inertia is increasingly not going to be applicable. We're going to be able to provide synthetic inertia with other solutions. The result of this is that we're increasingly seeing around the world utility scale renewables be deployed in conjunction with energy storage. Speaking of renewables, we just actually did a review of what has happened this year in terms of investment. And you can see the good news is that for the first half of this year, we've seen continued growth in renewable energy investment, although certainly the pace of growth has slowed down. By technology, solar is still doing really well, but other technologies are starting to show a significant slowdown. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is the policy headwinds that was also discussed in the last session. On the policy headwinds, just a quick note on the US. President Trump, as was asked in the previous session, has expressed significant skepticism towards climate change. And he's signed a lot of executive orders that are trying to undo his predecessors' climate change and mitigation initiatives. One of those has been around making coal great again. So he, back in April, he signed an executive order saying that he wants to increase coal mining and coal power generation in the US. It's important to remember during the first Trump administration, so if you look at the period of 2017 to 2021, the coal generation in the US actually declined. We don't expect any difference this time around. Since 2023, you can see that renewables have been significantly above coal generation. Of course, the decline of coal in the US was initially a gas story. You can see that in the case of the US, gas power generation took over from coal to become the largest source of electricity generation back in 2016, and that trend has continued. The combination of cheaper gas power generation and renewables in the US means that it's highly unlikely for coal power generation to be able to regain its market share. Now, this doesn't mean that renewables and energy storage don't face headwinds. The one big beautiful act now that was just passed by the Congress does reduce the time period for the incentives that are available for renewables and energy storage. Additionally, the Trump administration has been very, very interventionist in stopping particularly wind projects. The combination of these factors mean that already since the forecast that our team had produced at the first half of this year, which already took into account some of the Trump administration policies, we've had to revise down that forecast further. So now over the next 10 years, we're expecting 23% less capacity for solar, wind, and energy storage in the US. The US, again, as Ian also pointed out, renewables and EVs continue to grow despite the policy headwinds. Now, if you look closer here in Asia, one of the very interesting markets that has seen remarkable growth in renewables is Australia. And the reason I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on Australia is it's a very good example when you have the right power market design to incentivize technology offtake through competition. In the case of Australia, you can see that the capacity for solar and wind went from almost zero at the beginning of the century to now accounting for half of the installed base of the entire capacity in the Australian system. So the Australian system is only about 100 gigawatt, and you can see that here, solar and wind alone are already exceeding 50 gigawatt. The reason for that is, again, the competitiveness of these technologies. The Australian continent gets very good amount of sunshine year-round. So as a result of that, solar generation there is very effective, but parts of Australia also have very good wind resources, which again makes wind very competitive. When you have the uptake of solar and wind in a power system that's highly competitive, driven by 100% wholesale power market, the impact of this is that the solar and wind generations end up dominating whenever their resources are available, because they're zero marginal cost generators. As a result of that, their share continues to increase, particularly in the hours that they can generate. This results in significant volatility in power prices, including negative wholesale power prices. So the incidence of negative wholesale power prices in Australia have increased. While this does pose some challenges, including to the renewables themselves, it's great news for batteries, because if you're a battery, you can charge during those negative power price events and then discharge during those high wholesale power price events. So we've seen Australia get into a utility scale battery boom. One of the other things that's unique about Australia is the uptake of rooftop solar. So already today, 1/3 of detached houses in Australia have rooftop solar. That means the uptake going forward for rooftop solar will slow down, but this also creates, again, opportunities for behind-the-meter battery installations, where we see a lot of consumers start adopting batteries. The combination of these factors means that Australia's coal power fleet is already in decline, and by 2035, we expect about 70% of it to be retired. Keep in mind, Australia is one of the world's largest producers thermal coal. It, of course, competes with Indonesia in the seaborne coal market as well. Speaking of coal, I know you asked a question about China, and it's indeed true that China has continued to build coal power plants, and there's still a significant pipeline of coal power plants that we expect to come online by the end of this decade. Having said that, for example, if you look at the amount of coal built last year, so it's the 30 gigawatt, this is less than 1/10 of the solar capacity that China added. And overall, the share of coal in China's power capacity has dropped from 70% back in 2005 to only 35% in 2024. Of course, that share of capacity, if you look at annual generation, again, the share back at the beginning of the last decade in 2011 was around 79%. Last year, that share had declined to 56%. And while China is adding more coal capacity, the average capacity factor, the load factor for these power plants continue to decline. And actually, the regulator has already put in requirements that the coal power plants have to be able to run at much lower rates, meaning lower fuel consumption, lower emissions by the end of the decade. Effectively, what China is trying to do is take coal from being the base load generator to provide flexibility around renewables. Again, I do want to emphasize that, yes, we do expect that China's coal power fleet will grow by 2030 by another 5 to 10%, but its role will completely change. Its role will become as a source of flexibility to support renewables, particularly during times that renewables are underperforming. One of the reasons that China has been keen on increasing coal power capacity is as a security of supply. During 2021, 2022, unfortunately, in certain regions, they had power shortfalls because hydro was underperforming due to, unfortunately, droughts. So they're really building this additional capacity to make sure those situations can be avoided. One of the ways that they have done that is also to start providing capacity payments to coal power plants. Again, this allows them to run at lower load factors. We could get into debates around whether that's a good power market design or whether there would be other ways to achieve this. But you can see that even with the capacity payments for coal, still for solar plus storage and onshore wind plus storage in China, we expect those technologies to be more competitive than coal in 2030, meaning majority of the electricity generation hours will go to those technologies. Speaking of China, we should also remember that China has been investing more than any other country in energy transition technology deployment since 2013. Last year, of the $2.1 trillion, just around 45% came from China. As a share of GDP for last year, China's energy transition investment was equivalent to 4.5%. This is significantly higher than the EU average of 22%, so more than double that. And significantly higher than the US, which was 1.2% last year, which last year for the US was a relatively good year. China is also increasingly a source of exports of energy transition technologies all around the world, while until around 2022, more than half of those exports were going to OECD markets, so developed markets. Increasingly, actually, those exports are going into the global south and accelerating energy transition in the global south. Before I let you jump in with the next question, just very briefly on Southeast Asia and Malaysia. When we look at the power sector in Southeast Asia, it's certainly true that renewables have grown, but still thermal power plants dominate the region. So for example, if you look at Malaysia, as a share of generation, coal still remains king, followed closely by gas power generation. But you can see over the last few years, solar has had remarkable growth, at least in capacity terms, and then the generation numbers are starting to show as well. For renewables specifically, when we look at investment in renewables across Southeast Asia, it's been a bit of a boom-bust cycle if you look at the last 10 years. So you can see around 2018 to 2020, a significant jump. This is during the period where Vietnam initially had a very generous solar feed-in tariff and then a wind feed-in tariff. Unfortunately, the rates were overly generous, and as the government became conscious that these are not going to be sustainable, and they reduced the rates and put in more restrictions, then you can see the investments in Vietnam declined. More recently, though, it's been on a more steady state because we have seen majority of the region switch to more competitive auctions that are a better way to achieve price discovery instead of providing feed-in tariffs. By technology, while wind has had some periods of development, and in specific markets such as Indonesia and Philippines, geothermal has also had some success. It's really solar that continues to shine across the region. Speaking of solar, as US and Europe were putting restrictions on solar manufacturing from China, many of those manufacturers expanded their production capacity across Southeast Asia. Here you're looking at the value of exports from Southeast Asia for solar cells and modules to the US. You can see there was a boom period, but as we have seen with changes to trade policy by the US, some of these facilities are now challenged with exporting to the US. That's a challenge, but it also means that they're now increasingly trying to find new markets, including at home or nearby. So the solar supply in the region, for example, is starting to play an interesting role in the potential solar export power projects from Indonesia to Singapore. I will pause here before going to the next set to talk about where we are heading. If you would like to ask any questions now, or I can go to the next segment.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Izadi. I mean, this has been a tour de force, actually, in the financing and the growth of renewables compared, of course, to fossil sources of energy. We did have some questions come into the question. We keep those for later. Somebody did ask about the slides. A quick answer to that is it's yes, all the slides we believe will be made available. But I want to ask if Seng Kee, you have any questions or any follow-ups that you want to bring up with Dr. Izadi?
Yeah, Dr. Ali, very interesting presentation so far. How are you seeing, let's say, other source renewables, like, for example, geothermal, especially in Indonesia or Philippines? Would you want to elaborate a bit on that, please?
Yes, thank you very much. So geothermal is an amazing source of clean power generation, given that it's dispatchable and it's round the clock. The challenge with geothermal is twofold. One, if you look at conventional geothermal, you have to spend quite a bit of money to evaluate the resource before you can even start project development. That means that initial phase is very costly to finance. So if, for example, you go to a commercial bank, I know we're going to hear from a few of them later today, so it would be worth asking them. For a lot of commercial banks, if it's a geothermal reservoir that hasn't already been evaluated with test drills, then funding that phase, they will require a significant return, given that it's risky. One way to overcome this challenge is to provide a de-risking facility. We have seen this be done, for example, in Kenya, more recently in Philippines, where you have the combination of multilateral development banks together with governments come in and put in a source of essentially a fund at a lower borrowing cost for that phase. Yep. Then once the geothermal reservoir has been evaluated, then going to a bank to get financing for the actual project development can be done at a lower rate. So that's a very good way of overcoming this first challenge. The second challenge is that if we calculate the levelized cost of electricity generation for geothermal, it's certainly, in most places, it will be higher than solar or wind generation. However, because geothermal is round the clock, it has that added value. And if you have a power market design or an off-taker that can reward that, then it works quite effectively. In the APAC region, one of the most recent deals is actually in Taiwan, Google, which I believe you're going to hear from later today as well, they actually provided some funding for a geothermal project development that would power their data centers and facilities. So recognizing in applications where you're going to need 24/7 clean power and rewarding that can be very quite effective way of developing geothermal. Now, the third development, and Ian briefly mentioned these as well, you now have next generation geothermal technology using closed loops where you can actually develop resources that are not, you don't have to drill as deep, you don't have to find very, very hot reservoirs. These sort of closed loop systems will be really interesting if they can be scaled up and deployed in many places. Not only from an electricity decarbonization perspective, but actually more for heating applications, particularly in light industry. There are a couple of really interesting startups around there, so hopefully they'll succeed, and then we'll see those technologies be more widely adopted.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Ali. I suggest you continue. Mindful of time. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to discuss where do we think we're heading towards, and I'll focus first on Southeast Asia. So the good news is that if you look at the largest markets across the region, and we look at the latest power development plans that have been announced over the last couple of years, all of them have put more emphasis on renewables. So as a share of capacity additions, in all of them, solar is number one. Now, in some cases, gas is number two or number three. But then you can see other renewables be included as well. This is a very positive development. I know we can debate how realistic some of these plans are. And to be fair, many countries struggle to keep with their power development plans. By the way, that's not a unique challenge in Southeast Asia. Even if you look at power development plans where I'm based here in Korea or neighboring Japan, it is very common that reality ends up deviating from these plans. But this is a very good sign. More importantly, as I mentioned earlier, is that we've seen a rise of auctions for clean energy deployment. So Philippines has led in this area, but Malaysia has also done really well with its solar auctions. And we're seeing other markets start to learn these lessons and adopt them. Auctions, if they're designed well, they can be very effective in both driving down the cost of electricity procurement from renewables, but also providing certainty to developers and their investors. So you can find a happy medium where the developer and their investors are happy, but also that you're not providing excessive subsidies for renewables. Of course, a lot of this is about how you design your auction. If you don't design your auction very well, to be frank, we've seen, for example, in the case of the renewable auctions in Japan, then it wouldn't work as well. For solar, we expect that the markets across the region continue to grow simply because of economics. You can see that we see pretty much all markets across the region to experience growth over the coming 5 years, and the overall capacity we expect will be able to actually provide a meaningful source of generation compared to the numbers that I showed you earlier by the end of this decade. Wind is a little bit more specific to geography, given that wind resources widely vary across Southeast Asia. The closer we get to the equator, the average wind speeds tend to be slower. But there are still regions in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Laos and Philippines, that have very, very good wind resources, and we expect those to be able to achieve deployment. By the way, there's a lot of enthusiasm around offshore wind in the region as well, particularly in Vietnam and Philippines. For truly offshore wind, meaning projects that require a vessel to install, we don't expect any of them to be commissioned this side of the decade. But for nearshore projects, we've already seen quite a lot of deployment in Vietnam, and we do expect continued deployment of nearshore wind in both Vietnam and Philippines in the remaining years in this decade. Energy storage is also starting to see a significant uptake. For energy storage, Philippines was the pioneer in the region when the National Grid Corporation of Philippines actually held a tender for energy storage. We're starting to see more interesting models, including in Malaysia, the consideration of procuring energy storage through auctions. Providing the right power mechanism to power market design to incentivize energy storage is quite key. As I showed you earlier, Australia is an extreme example where 100% wholesale power pool with high uptake of renewables end up incentivizing energy storage deployments. We've seen other models, such as in Japan, where a decarbonization auction provides incentives for deploying energy storage. Now, one area that I know is on everyone's mind is data centers, and we expect that electricity demand for data centers across the ASEAN region to also rapidly increase. We estimate the annual electricity consumption of data centers installed in ASEAN last year was just around 5 terawatt hours. We expect that number to grow by about, apologies, it was 7 terawatt hours, and we expect that number to grow to about 65 terawatt hours by the year end. There are a lot of interesting projects that have been announced, including those that want to do 100% clean power procurement. When we look globally, many of the hyperscalers that are behind the deployment and usage of data centers, they all have very firm commitments around their own Scope 2 emissions, and in some cases, Scope 3 emissions as well. Those companies, all of them would love to have access to clean power procurement. Across the Southeast Asian region, we have seen improvements in the clean power procurement options available. However, because the renewable power supply in places such as Malaysia still remains limited, then having affordable, ample clean power procurement options is still limited. In the region, still many companies rely on buying unbundled RECs, unbundled renewable energy certificates. While currently that may seem as an appropriate measure, as some of you would be aware, the greenhouse gas protocol is actually under review. And depending on where the revisions land, the rules around Scope 2 emissions and the use of unbundled RECs, particularly unbundled RECs procured outside of the market where the electricity consumption is happening, might become more challenging in the future. So it's important to actually address this issue of having more clean, affordable power procurement supply in each market. Just a little bit more on data centers, given that I believe a lot of the audience might be interested. It's certainly true that when we look at the average size of data centers that are being deployed around the world, the numbers have significantly increased. Last year, the global average IT capacity for data centers was about 15.7 megawatt. That was already more than double the number back in 2014, which was 7.5 megawatt. And then if you look at the global average, by the end of this decade, the global average reaches around 254 megawatt. The US is leading on this, and you can see that the average numbers in the US are significantly higher. Today, in terms of live IT capacity, the US accounts for half of the world. Globally, we are seeing significant growth. The growth rate is actually the fastest in the US as well as here in the Asia Pacific region. So across Americas, the growth rate is around 18.1%, whereas in the Asia Pacific region, it's been on 17.9%, so almost the same. And then the Europe, Middle East, and Africa is a little bit at a lower trajectory. Question is where we go from here. We've done a lot of bottom-up analysis on the electricity consumption of data centers, not just for AI applications, but across all applications. Last year, globally, data centers consumed about 400 terawatt hour. If data centers were their own country, they would be comparable to, say, Saudi Arabia, a little bit bigger than Indonesia. By 2035, we expect this number to quadruple. If you look at as a share of electricity demand, interestingly, it's the developed economy, the OECD markets, where as a share of electricity demand, they would experience the highest impact. The main reason is in these markets, there's not as many other sources of electricity demand growth. In some places, yes, EVs are also adding to electricity demand growth. But in many of these markets, due to population decline and changes in the structure of the economy, actually electricity demand has either been flat for the last couple of decades or in some cases even declining. As a result of this, now you have a new source that's growing. So as a share of demand, the numbers will be larger. If you look across the fast-growing economies, such as across Southeast Asia, the share of electricity demand growth from data centers will actually be relatively limited. Now, this is not to say that data centers won't pose a challenge. One of the issues is that while as a share of annual electricity consumptions, data centers may not be a very large number, the location that you need to deploy data centers for some applications where you want to have them, for example, in the CBD of KL, it might be challenging to provide the power in that specific location, given that they need a lot of power at a single node. So overcoming those challenges will be very critical. There's also the issue of how will these impact emissions. When we did our modeling, we ran the model with the additional electricity demand from data centers and without it. The bar chart here shows you the incremental growth in generation globally when you add the electricity demand from data centers versus without it. You can see that if under our economic transition scenario, which doesn't include any sort of policy intervention, doesn't try to optimize for climate change, rather just tells the model to build least system cost, thermal power plants come ahead. In capacity terms, they're almost equal. But in generation terms, thermal power plants come ahead. This, of course, would be a challenging outcome from the perspective of climate change. The good news, though, again, many of the companies involved are definitely trying to maximize the amount of clean power procurement that they can do. We should also remember that data centers is just one new vector of growth for electricity demand. Globally, electric vehicles will actually be larger. And of course, in many markets, we are also seeing higher adoption of air conditioning as well as heat pumps that we need to take into account as well. So if you look at the next 25 years under our economic transition scenario, the good news is that in majority of markets, you can see renewables will grow. You can see some markets, for example, in Indonesia, we do expect under this scenario coal to continue to grow its share, but then you can see in the coming decades it comes down. These are, of course, normalized values, so you may wonder what does this mean in terms of absolute values. When we look at coal in absolute values, we expect that overall consumption of coal will actually decline by about 25% in the coming decade. And then thereafter, the decline will be slower. The biggest reason for that decline is China. And we expect that given that the renewable capacity growth in China is now starting to catch up with electricity demand growth, starting from this year, we're likely to see coal consumption decline. And already the data that's available for the first 8 months of the year suggests that this prediction will likely come true. Of course, some of this will depend on weather, particularly performance of hydro generation. If hydropower generation undergoes droughts again, then it may elongate a little bit the coal peak. But this peak is unlikely to grow significantly for China. Other markets such as India and Southeast Asia will continue to increase their absolute consumption of coal, but renewables will still grow significantly. Now, this would be, if you're an optimist, you would say, wow, this is an economic transition scenario. We are not talking about any additional policy interventions and still renewables grow. The downside, of course, is that under this scenario, the global average surface temperature rise that we would experience would be around 2.6 degrees Celsius, which is obviously way beyond what the Paris Agreement goal is. So we have to consider measures to go further. If we want to go further, we have to accelerate decarbonization of the power sector. Ian eloquently explained why clean power is really important. Just to emphasize again, when we look at abating emissions associated with fossil fuel consumption, clean power coupled with electrification, as well as clean fuels that are produced from clean power, this combination provides more than 75% of the emission abatement that we need between now and 2050 from the energy system. Without increased adoption of clean power coupled with increased electrification, we won't be able to tackle climate change and meet the Paris Agreement goal. There's a variety of technologies that are needed to achieve this. Most notably, though, is about wind and solar, energy storage, and electric vehicles. The lines here, the solid lines, show you the adoption under our economic transition scenario, whereas the dashed line is the Paris-aligned net zero scenario. So you can see the adoption rates for these technologies has to be significantly higher. The impact of that would, of course, be that fossil fuel consumptions will go down. Fossil fuel consumption doesn't go down to zero, but it goes to levels that is either being used as feedstock, not for combustion, or if it's being used for combustion, it is coupled with carbon capture and storage. The electricity generation mix
Dr. Lee, I do have a question. Sorry, I intervene you a little bit here. Because I'm looking at this scenario, right? What need to be done to actually expedite it? I mean, is there like some policy intervention from government, or how are we going to push this forward, right? If not, we still have this gap going forward, unfortunately.
Yeah, very good question. If I may have 3 minutes, I will get to that point. I have a slide on it, if that would be okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. So the generation mix will vary by market because obviously the renewable resource potentials are different. In some places, we could even consider use of nuclear. But you can see that in majority of the markets, the colors of yellow and blue, which is solar and wind, end up dominating. Many of you may wonder, well, how could we balance such a renewable heavy system? Indeed, we do expect to see a role for nuclear as well as thermal power plants. For thermal power plants, unabated coal would be virtually zero. We would still have a lot of peaker gas turbines left in the system, but we wouldn't dispatch them that much. Essentially, this means that these gas turbines would remain in the system for backup reasons, but you're not using them as much. You only use them during days where solar and wind are not generating. There would also be a lot of thermal power plants that are equipped with carbon capture and storage. Again, the load factors for those power plants will be relatively low because they will be very expensive to run. When you put in a CCS system on a coal plant, you roughly pay a 1/3 efficiency penalty because the CCS unit also consumes energy. So you don't want to run it as much. You only want to run it during times that you really need it. Similarly, for hydrogen or ammonia compatible turbines, again, there would be a significant amount. The distribution varies by system, but you don't run them that much because they're very, very expensive to run. And then if you have nuclear, on the other hand, nuclear running it is actually quite cheap, so you would run it at the maximum output. So let me get into a little bit the question that was just asked specifically in the context of Malaysia. So let me first, on Malaysia, say one very positive note. So I think the approach Malaysia has had with JC3 and then the publication of the National Energy Transition Roadmap 2 years ago is very positive. It shows a very good sort of momentum by both the government, public sector, and the private sector coming together and discussing these issues. And coming up with a detailed roadmap as a starting point is very, very helpful. However, if I look at the scenarios under the NETR, if you look at the responsible transition in 2050, there's still a heavy reliance on oil and gas. So if you look at the power sector specifically under NETR, in capacity terms, yes, solar becomes really large, but then you have a lot of gas power generation left in the system. And in the case of NETR, the way to abate the remaining emissions is a significant reliance on using offsets via land use change, and forestry. So you can see, again, this is the exact copy from the NETR. You can see the residual emissions that are left, this 164 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The idea is that we would be able to offset those with land use cover and forestry, land use change and forestry. The challenge with this is if you look at Malaysia's historical emission, take into account land use change, and forestry, there's only been a very brief period where land use change, and forestry actually acted as a negative sink, as abating emissions. There are a lot of challenges with, while there are nature-based solutions that can provide offsets, relying on them too much can be a very challenging proposition. So instead, we need to minimize as much as possible the amount of emissions left in the system. When we ran our scenarios under the economic transition scenario for Malaysia, yes, coal remains in the system and some gas, but you can see a lot of renewables and battery growth. Under the net zero scenario, assuming Malaysia does not build more interconnections with its neighbors, then our scenario ends up having a little bit of nuclear, a lot more solar, and in some places even wind. If you look at generation mix, again, you can see that in our scenario under the economic transition scenario, it's a solar coal story essentially, because that would be the cheapest. On the other hand, in the net zero scenario, so this power system would not emit as much as what the NETR has considered. So how do you achieve this? Obviously, one area that's really important is investment. If you look at the $2.1 trillion that I mentioned was invested in energy transition globally last year, if you want to align with our net zero scenario, we would have to have that annual investment increase to about $5.6 trillion for the remaining years in this decade. And then another increase globally in the next decade. And then it sort of plateaus thereafter. Now, if you look at from the perspective of the ratios that I mentioned earlier, that means the 1.1 ratio that was experienced last year, that would have to increase to an average of 7.6 by the end of this decade in terms of investment in clean supply versus fossil fuel supply. If you look at it by market, China is the closest to our net zero scenario. It would still need to almost double its investment. If you look at other markets, particularly across Southeast Asia, then the multipliers are much larger. So to answer your question directly, the investment requirements are really high, but they're within the realm of possibility for financial institutions. What is required, though, is having the right regulatory framework to attract these investments. And in the power sector, this starts with power market design. The reason that Australia has had such a rapid transition, despite the fact that it's blessed with lots of coal, it had a very large coal fleet, abundant supply of coal locally, was basically it had a very competitive power market system, meaning that when renewables entered the system, they could automatically eat the amount of hours available to thermal power generators. If you look at many markets around the world, including Malaysia, the challenge is that the power market design currently is very inefficient. And more importantly, if you look at electricity retail prices in Malaysia, they're currently essentially subsidized. That means when TNB is selling electricity to consumers, it's actually selling it below its cost of procurement. If you have a system like that where the electricity is not valued at its true cost, funding the transition becomes really difficult. TNB will not be able to, on its own, raise the required funding to make the transition, but also it'll be very difficult for newcomers to enter. Now, as we've seen, for example, with the auctions as well as the clean power procurement options that the government has given, where you open some opportunities for increased competition and price discovery ability, then you do see movement and the market grows. But more needs to be done. Essentially, what it requires is one, policymakers around the world in markets where energy is still heavily subsidized, they have to have an honest conversation with their populations around the cost of energy, as well as including the impact of climate change. It doesn't mean that electricity prices have to rise for all consumers. Obviously, vulnerable consumers should be protected, and those can be targeted. But giving affluent consumers cheap electricity is not really a good way of achieving energy transition. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ali. We just need to keep an eye on the time here. But before I move into the closing remarks, perhaps, since we reached the top of the hour, in terms of the energy mix, that the graphs that you showed earlier, I saw that the bioenergy component was very, very small, particularly compared with the gas component. Yes, you can see right there the sort of cream colored, here. The assumption, of course, is that the biomass is simply combusted or incinerated or uses that kind of technology. Given the fact that we are going to have gas turbines running, and with the continued development of pyrolysis and gasification technologies for not just agro biomass or forest biomass, but also extending even into other waste products such as municipal waste and even used tires, for that matter. Advances in pyrolysis and gasification. Is that something that might fit this gap and sort of fill the bill between sort of this inability to get higher investments in bioenergy and other kinds of gasification technologies, which could then, fuel a sort of combined cycle scenario, which is the most efficient way, of course, to use any gaseous fuel. Like your views on that, and perhaps what might be able to jumpstart the investments in this area. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you're right. There are definitely different technology pathways. The challenge with biomass for power generation, including waste to energy generation, usually comes down to the low energy density of the feedstocks. So if you have the feedstocks available very close to a facility that can process them and generate power, then certainly that can be quite effective. The challenge, unfortunately, is if you look at, for example, where the CCGTs are in Malaysia and where you've got the feedstock, then the cost and the energy associated with transporting that feedstock to those locations becomes a significant hurdle, both economically, but also from the perspective of making your energy efficiency actually work out so that you come out ahead, because you don't want to be using more energy to transport the fuel than the energy that the fuel actually generates. This is the biggest challenge with different types of waste to energy and biomass. The other important consideration is that, and I didn't have a chance to spend enough time discussing, so we do have to decarbonize aviation as well as shipping. And in those applications, certainly electrification plays a role in some applications, for example, in nearshore, but also onboard power. But ultimately, if you think about, for example, the dry bulk carriers or container ships that go from Malaysia to Europe and elsewhere, for those we will need high energy density liquid clean fuels. And in those cases, that's where biofeedstocks are much more valuable. Similarly, when we talk about aviation decarbonization, certainly there are routes, for example, electrifying the KL Singapore route would be easy. To be fair, that's probably a route better for high-speed rail, but that's a different topic. If you look at long-haul flights there, if you want to fly from KL to London or New York, that's not a flight that can be electrified. And then there again, you need the feedstocks from those resources. So prioritizing the limited biofeedstocks that we have available to produce those high energy density clean molecules for aviation and shipping decarbonization is much more valuable than trying to gasify them to use for power generation.
Yeah. Thanks for that insight. Anything else you wanted to ask, SK?
No, I think I'm mindful of time. Yeah. I think
so perhaps perhaps we could get some closing remarks from you, Dr. Izadi, on if you had one thing you wanted to get out there, perhaps perhaps a giant myth about renewable energy financing that's out there that you could dispel.
So if I may, and apologies, there were many slides. If you have one takeaway from my message is that we're not going to be able to solve power market design problems with technology. That requires a policy solution. So waiting for a magic technology to come and solve that for us is not going to happen. It does require really undertaking power market reform to address that.
On that note, thank you so very, very much. We've been talking with Dr. Ali Izadi, who is the head of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Thank him for his most valuable insights into
thank you very much, Dr. Ali.
Financing of renewable energy globally, as well as in the region, and also in Malaysia, as well as for his views on how perhaps Malaysia might be able to move forward, leveraging on the institutions and the governance frameworks that we've set up already. Thank you so very, very much for joining us. As always, look forward to welcoming you again at our very next Climate Governance Summit, Global Summit. With that, I hand it back to Jia Tian for the next session.
Thank you.